Now, Philip Baum, the editor of Aviation Security International, a London-based aviation security consultant, joins me in the studio. There's quite a lot to cover there, Philip. Can we begin with the psychological scrutiny? How much is currently done of pilots on European routes?
Well, pretty much pilots on all routes around the world are subject to psychological evaluation during the recruitment process, where they not only go through a medical, but they actually go through a psychological evaluation. After that, once they're already working for the airline, every pilot goes through an annual medical review. There is no additional psychological review, although the doctors that are actually performing the medical review do generally ask questions that could determine whether or not the person may have psychological problems.
Only if you answered them honestly.
Well, only if you answered them honestly, absolutely. But I think that generally the airline industry relies on internal reporting, that the peers, the colleagues of pilots should be able to identify when somebody's not behaving as they normally do. And you must remember that every pilot also goes through annual simulator training, training them or evaluating whether they're able to respond to a security or safety incident in flight. And during that process, one gets a really good opportunity to evaluate the psychological well-being of a pilot.
I see. The changes to the cockpit door were brought in very swiftly in the aftermath of the September the 11th atrocities 14 years ago. And unless I've misunderstood, this couldn't have happened the day before those atrocities because of the old system of cockpit doors being always openable.
Well, they weren't always openable, they were locked, but they weren't as strong as they are today. Now we have them being, to a certain extent, blast resistant, bulletproof, and as you've seen, extremely difficult to actually break through. I think it was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction after September the 11th, and that's actually what I would advise airlines today, not to just rush quickly to install new systems.
You do advise airlines today. Have you advised some? And I don't expect you to breach client confidentiality, but have you been calling for this for a while?
Ever since September the 11th and prior to September the 11th, we've been training crew how to manage security incidents in flight, and indeed we've actually been very concerned about.
But will there be chief executives and airlines who have been warned specifically about the danger of this lockout, this pilot lockout, and they've ignored it?
Absolutely. I mean, you only have to look at the Ethiopian Airlines hijack of February last year, when the co-pilot locked out the captain of the aircraft, and fortunately he only wanted to claim asylum in Switzerland, but that should have been an alarm call to the industry because he could have been suicidal. 3 months before that, we had a Mozambique Airlines captain who managed to shut out the first officer of his flight and did crash the aircraft. We've had aircraft-assisted suicide, which is the term that the industry uses, quite a few times, indeed far more times than we've actually had terrorists taking control of aircraft and flying them into population centres. So these incidents do happen, and we do need to train aircrew how to respond to them. And I'm very worried about simply, although I advocate having 2 people in the flight deck at all times, you can't just move from one system to another overnight. You have to train the crew how to access the flight deck, because what you don't want to do is have the door open for long periods of time whilst the crew member's going in and the pilot's going out, because that's a security vulnerability in its own right.
So as it stands, history could repeat itself on any number of flights currently taking off and landing around the world.
Well, we have to remember that realistically there are around about 100,000 flights in the air every day. Probably at this minute, probably 10 or 11,000 flights. There are 3 million people taking to the skies every day. This is one incident. It is a tragic incident, and you cannot guarantee security. You can do only so much. But I do think we need to avoid knee-jerk reactions. I do think that this demonstrates yet again that we need to look at intent, not only passengers' intent, aircrew's intent, the people that are working on the inside of the industry's intent. It's not all about prohibited items.
Philip Baum, thank you very much indeed. Now, only last September, President Obama cited Yemen as an anti-terrorism success story. Tonight, it's on the brink of collapse.